Live free or die. One of the states has that on their license plate, and I've always thought about it most of my life. And I think that says everything. When we realize that our system is broken and doing the right thing is to disobey, then we really consider this expression. Are we willing to die? Most people aren't even willing to get arrested or go to court for freedom and truth. And I think this expression really draws a line in the sand. Freedom by any and all means, not freedom only if we're given permission. And this may be the most important question. Once you realize truth, are you willing to die for truth? Are you willing to die for freedom? And personally, I'd rather die while living my truth and freedom than to live 1,000 years, even partially free. Welcome. I'm going to open up with some pictures I found on the Spartan Red channel. And here is a great example of nothing other than a melted building. It seems like all the ruins I explored in my neck of the woods have very little pockets of survival, but this here is a great example of a pocket. My particular desert seems to have been cooked out so hard that only faint imprints remain. But after exploring things like this, we know exactly what we're looking at. That this ground and building were melted from the bottom up, similar to what we've seen in videos where a circuit board is melting and ultimately engulfing these buildings. And we do see what looks like the remains of burning. And these ruins are probably some of the oldest in our realm. We often consider how ridiculous it would be to build these buildings of the past with the primitive means available at the time. And what of these ruins? Are we really to believe that someone came out here and chiseled all of this into the stone? I think this answer is pretty obvious. And here we go. Ultimately a castle, now turned to mountain. Little pockets remaining, little openings into the old building, and meanwhile the archaeologists scratch their heads. Or even worse, giving us some ridiculous story. And I think at this point in time, no other theory does these buildings justice. Nothing else can come close to explaining what we're seeing here. And in some parts, the buildings become so damaged, they are almost completely unrecognizable. And history and biology seeming to be a team in erasing our history, confusing the masses, letting us believe that things like this would be created by ice, carving out little windows over millions of years, and really just spitting on all common sense and logic. And again, this stage being further along in the melting process than ruins as seen in Petra or even Cappadocia. And if these were any closer to civilization, people would move into them. But most of these found in the middle of nowhere. And this will be from a YouTube video I saw called K2019, The Great Pyramid. It came highly recommended and very interesting. And this is a piece of wood embedded in a stone in Egypt. And these guys are making an excellent case that these giant stones are not cut, are not quarried and hauled around the desert. And in fact, this man back in the 80s discovered the exact formula through testing and analysis, and they've recreated this geopolymer, the absolute formula for the pyramids. And basically, they were saying that modern concrete and ancient concrete is almost impossible to differentiate from stone, for they both have the exact same composition, similar to replicating diamonds. And this is worth trying for oneself. He gives the exact formula. And this here is the Dr. Joseph Davidovits. And of course, he was refuted by the scientific community. And shortly after, the Egyptian government came out and made a bold statement saying that the pyramids were not cast. So I'm still watching this, but this is a fascinating documentary. And this next part is something I saw on Mud Fossil University. And by now it's old news. Martin has touched on it. A lot of people probably have. But how can I not share this wonderful find? And here he's showing some scientific program on the television. And these scientists have done a scan of this statue, this Buddha statue, said to be 1,000 years old. And what we see when they do some ultrasonic photograph is bones and an actual body in here. And let me show you that. And here we are. What is actually inside this statue? And this makes me question all statues, especially the ones that are so lifelike. This one wasn't even very lifelike. And this makes me question everything that we see. How everything seems to be a facade. The buildings, the statues, our whole reality. Absolutely mind-blowing. And I'll keep this short. And this next part's a little trip I took in Salt Lake City, just showing some of the lesser-known buildings and features. And very intricate. I wonder if we can carbon date some of this wood. I think carbon dating is pretty worthless, but it would be interesting. And what is this building? I'm not sure. Look at the expression and the realism in this ornamental head, the shine in the eyes, the feeling and the delicacy of these frills, obviously not carved, but even if cast, absolutely genius. How strong is this concrete? And really amazing. I've mentioned that these are like a kit created off-site and assembled. Some facades appear to be plastered and some appear to be kits, like you see here. And this is an Italian restaurant, Michelangelo's. And this main street, really, since I've known downtown Salt Lake, has just been in disrepair. There's always been boards up over this beautiful architecture and never making sense to me until now. In some cases I have seen preserving when they do restoring of these buildings, saving the facade. However, we know in many cases these buildings are demolished, still having little appreciation for the works of this past time and people. And look at the detail here. Unbelievable that this building would have boards. Here again, I'm looking at the Walker Center, the radio tower. Look at all these little detailed facades. Seems like they just focused on the windows, some trim. Remarkable. Just applying this facade underneath, having absolute faith in your adhesion materials. And I really do think the concrete and building materials in general were superior to ours. And I've featured this set of buildings before. This, I think, is the Salt Lake Stock Exchange, and clearly old world. And here we can see the original brick on the side. They didn't bother with the side, hence why it's a facade. And yet I really do think this lends to two resets. The old brick world taken over by the facaders, and then we repurpose the facaders and demolish them. And here's just a small building on the side here, but I was really impressed again with a marble type of facade, very shiny, So we have some lions, fruit coming out of their mouth. And here are some different kind of lions. Here one has broken off, it seems like. Maybe they tried knocking all of them off. Clearly seeming like they've been broken off. And I think whatever was written up here has been plastered over, because this looks really sloppy.
Is that the building that they were going to tear down? That building sat here? Are you serious? Basically?
So here I was talking to some police officers guarding the courthouse, and they told me of an interesting find. Here is a big courthouse, and I was always worried that they were going to tear it down. The plan was to tear it down, and instead they just tore down all the buildings around it. And what these policemen told me is that this building, this brick building, was actually sitting across the street, and they moved it just within 5 or so years. And unbelievable. I would love to see pictures of this, and I have no doubt that they did. This is very recent, but yet mind-blowing. And this is a case of historical preservation. They actually moved this building across the street. We'll have a little look at it. And this was a fun trip. It was actually very nice to get out. I think we've all felt cooped up. And very intricate. Look at the brickwork. So this has had very little facade work done on it. And the old brick work is superior to any brickwork we see today. Their ability to create these patterns and impressions and protrusions is astounding. And here's a little bit I did on Buffalo. More of an exploration, but some interesting finds. Now here we shall have a look at a place called Buffalo. Originally starting out in 1789 as a small trading community, the city grew quickly after opening the Erie Canal in 1825. 1825, we have less than 5,000 or 6,000 people, and just opening the Erie Canal, and it quickly becomes one of the most populous cities in the United States. It hosted the Pan American Exposition in 1901, and later became a hub for the automotive industry. And post-1950, the city would lose over half of its population. And Buffalo is a fascinating city to explore. Amongst one of my favorites, right up there with Salt Lake City and San Francisco. Why? Because they were all said to have been created around the 1850s. Latecomers in the game of development. And they seem to just sprout up without a hiccup in a very short time frame. And when we look carefully, things seem much older. And some of my favorite repurposings, redesignations of buildings in Buffalo. I once saw a beautiful, round, perimetered building in the Greco-Roman style, full of ornamentation. And in the particular photo, black and white, it was a chicken restaurant. And I've been trying to find that photo for at least 2 years now. But nevertheless, today I was watching a video by Dustin Berserker Bear, and he was showing Buffalo. Fascinating anomalies. The first thing that I noticed is how all these roads are laid out, of course, in this super intricate grid. And surveying is not an easy thing. I surveyed my small property. I helped the surveyor to save $1, and it was an all-day thing. And as always, when we look carefully, we can see the marks of the old world, and these grids being one way to identify that we're dealing with something much older. Even with all of the demolishing of structures The very grid itself might be the last thing that we're able to see, and super, super high tech. And the narrative was absolutely fascinating, this very recent narrative. And we really can just follow this advanced grid, and it will take us to these sacred sites. And so, with that in mind, if we were following these lines, the bulk of them leading to the coast. As we know, the old world was a seafaring people in a time before our time. A very interesting monument here. And as I made my way to the coast, my mind began looking for star forts and artificial coastlines. And we do see that here. Very nice cut corners, massive block or concrete of the old world. And I continued to follow it, and here again we can see how perfectly advanced. And again, if every building was torn down, such things would be the last of the evidence from the old world. Things that just wouldn't make sense to people even 100 years from now. And people would pick up on this trail once again. And here I continued along this fascinating artificial coastline. And as you can see, islands. And these always just being stupid designations in modern times. Whatever this is, and for whatever reason these half a dozen cars are here, there's probably very little explanation about the construction that we're seeing here. And this is obviously the remains of a star fort turned into a parking lot. And of course turned into airports. And in more recent times, some of my favorite, in which I haven't shared much on, are dumps. And today we'll just look at a little dump. I could go on and on about this coastline, just absolutely mind-blowing and artificial and absolutely fascinating. And I continued along this river, which is just fascinating in its own right. So here I was just looking at this little peninsula and this wonderful, choice piece of land, nice and artificially cut. And what do we have here? What is so important? We have this amazing dock and remains of something very important at one point in time, and now just looking like Sanford and Sons. Recently I mentioned something in Jerome, Arizona, and if you guys are wondering where that was, it was by the dump. And really I think we're just seeing a lot of cover-up, intentionally made to look uninteresting and unappealing, and yet I think these are ruins. Even here by this little dump we see train tracks. So train tracks leading to nothing now. But this at one point would have been a very important area. See the train tracks continue, even splitting off here, and you can still see their impression in the trees, the cover-up trees. And these tracks continue this way, and also if we follow the river, we of course see train tracks all throughout here. This may have been the concrete factory that I was talking about, but clearly sitting on an artificial coastline, sitting on top of ruins, part of the building itself. This thing is just massive. I'm sure it was repurposed and seeming to be in disuse now. This is an old worlder here, overgrown, showing all the characteristics of an old star fort. Very interesting. And there was one more place I was looking for along this river. Again, look at this angle. Look at this. And if you've seen star forts and the surrounding waters around them, you'll recognize this immediately. A, this is not natural. B, this is high-tech engineering. And just in a very industrial seeming part of town where nobody would really notice. And finally, I'm absolutely going to end with this Saint Hilarion Castle. I recently saw this on the Wooden Nickels channel, and a great example of just what we're talking about. Something that may be right on the edge of being recognized as a structure made by man. And here, just seeming so similar to what we looked at in New Mexico. Even the massive wall that we saw running down, still remaining in this case. Said to have been built around the 14th century, and the glorious wall surrounding it, made of rough masonry, is 1.4 meters thick. And thanks for joining me today. Do have a blessed day. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Oh, and one more thing about death. Should we fear death? Personally, I don't think so. I think our main concern should be life, and living a good and free life. Death is the least of our concerns. Nobody will know the hour of one's death, but we can strive to have a better life, which is much more important.